Great, thank you, and hello, everyone. Good morning, well, at least it's still morning here. And welcome to our presentation for the Education and Jobs track. My name is Elizabeth, and I am the Sherpa for this track. I just wanted to, again, introduce my incredible team of delegates who will be presenting. Zoe Martin representing the UK, Michael Leyendecker representing Germany, Kurtbir Shahal representing Canada, Kanako Yamagami representing Japan, Khadija Al-Khalila Ben Romhain representing France, Vanessa Boy representing Italy, Carolina Viscosava representing the EU, and Giovanni Bruna representing the USA. So now you can switch over to the next slide, and I will hand it over to Zoe to begin.
Hi, I'm Zoe Martin and I am the UK delegate. Firstly, I would just like to say a massive thank you to our Sherpa Elizabeth and the YPFP for all of their help and guidance over the last couple of months throughout the negotiations process. When the delegates from all the G7 countries came together for education and jobs, we looked to define the track. We decided that we should not only focus on the individual sectors themselves, but the link between the two and how well the education systems across G7 countries prepare youth for the world of work. Although both education and jobs have differing structures across all G7 countries, essentially, when it comes to education, we are looking at the process of facilitating learning or the acquisition of knowledge, skills, values, beliefs, and habits, whilst jobs is referring to the labour markets in the individual countries. In whatever form that may be, the G7 countries came to the conclusion that education and jobs across the globe should be more consistent. All delegates gathered a sense on how the youth in their countries view education and jobs and what education and jobs means to them. We then proceeded to combine these views to create a definition of what G7 countries consider the track of education and jobs to be, and the kinds of issues that we may experience and need to overcome. With over 250 million young people out of school and over 70 million unemployed youth around the world, the future for youth education and jobs looks bleak. There is a need now more than ever with the current COVID-19 situation for the rights of education and work to be identified in order to promote respect for human dignity and kickstart the road of transformative change for young people. Underfunded education systems, outdated curricula, youth unprepared to enter the labour market, youth unemployment and NEET trends, the need for innovative teaching methods, future of work and digitalisation, investments in digital resources and exchange programs. These are just some of the areas in need of change so that we can rethink and rebuild education and employment systems across the globe. We, as a G7, need to ensure that the youth across the world have an opportunity for a full education system and labour market that fully prepares them for the world of work. I will now pass over to Giovanni from the US, who will continue explaining our defining the track process. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. My name is Giovanni Bruna. I'm from the USA delegation, and I'd also like to express my gratitude to my colleagues, our Sherpa Elizabeth, and the entire YPFP leadership for their support throughout this whole journey. So for a bit of background, I'd like to start off with saying that education policy includes laws as well as processes and policies that educational organizations, local districts, states, and nations put in place and follow to achieve academic goals. Similarly, employment policy includes laws as well as processes and policies that set and promote labor standards and the fundamental principles and rights at work, and that includes programs to ensure decent work for all. G7 youth are yearning to achieve their full potential by securing access to high-quality, inclusive, and equitable education that will prepare them for the labor market of tomorrow. However, long-standing structural inequalities have been exacerbated by the current coronavirus pandemic, resulting in the urgent need for innovative reforms both at schools and work environments. Creating 21st century jobs that promote the competitiveness and the prosperity of the G7 labor force is imperative. So how do we go about that? Updates to outdated curriculums, mentorship opportunities, and investment in marginalized communities to support vulnerable populations are just some of the ways to make education more inclusive. Empowering youth through expert career advice, digital skills training, civic education, and soft skills can prepare students for the future of work, especially considering transformations in both AI and the green economy of tomorrow. Supporting flexible learning and work modalities, promoting the benefits of low-carbon jobs, and declaring the internet as a public good can all contribute to building resilient systems that prioritize well-being and a healthy work-life balance that we're all seeking. Finally, one way to facilitate a sustainable post-COVID recovery is to achieve the SDGs. We strongly encourage the G7 to lead the world in implementing the 2030 Agenda in a timely and responsible manner. In fact, SDG 17, as we all know, focuses on partnerships, which are crucial to ensure that no one is left behind. I will pass over to Michael, who will go over our negotiations process.
Thank you very much, Gio. Next slide, please. Hi, I'm Michael. I'm from the German delegation, and as we want to focus on topics and themes, this topic will be really short and sharp. Our negotiation process was marked by the principle of compromise. After each delegate presented their country's context regarding education and work, we shaped the policy recommendations, also having the previous G7 and Y7 communities in mind. We identified common themes and proposals and started to create our communique. As a last step, we shortened it to the core topics and content and customized the language. Overall, it was a great honor to negotiate with these people because they are always able to find a compromise, and so we really got to the point, and now we are all very happy with this communique. I will now pass on to Kana, who will describe the challenges and considerations about our topic.
Thank you, Michael. Next slide, please. I'm Kanka Nogami, and I'm the Japanese delegate. I'm beyond thankful for this incredible journey with my lovely fellow delegates and our helper, and of course, can thank the YPFP for making this possible. That being said, Karina and I like to talk about challenges and constellations regarding both the negotiation process and the topic itself. As for the negotiation process, we had 4 major challenges. First of all, 8 of us had different contexts and personal views regarding education and jobs. As we are all from different countries and cultures with different occupations, we brought up various priorities to the negotiation table. Thus, we worked hard to find a common ground and compromise with each other without leaving out the priorities of each country. Secondly, when we gathered all the policy recommendations, we had more than 10 pages. Thus, it was definitely a challenge for us to shorten our document to 2 pages while including all the important points, and this process took longer than we thought. Thirdly, we negotiated the language and tried our best to choose the appropriate language to express what we really mean and try to make it as specific and powerful as possible. Finally, we had discussions on how much we should specifically mention the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on education and jobs. In March, we, as the Y7, issued our statement and policy recommendations regarding COVID-19, which had a heavy focus on its impact on education and jobs. Thus, this time, we tried to expand them and further tackle both existing inquiries and new challenges emerged in the context of the pandemic. Moving on to the challenges regarding the topic of education and jobs, we believe there are 4 points to be taken into consideration. The first point is the importance of taking an intersectional approach. In many cases, education is led by the government and educational institutions, and the private sector is the driving force in the current labor market. However, we strongly believe it is essential to reinforce collaboration and partnerships between the sectors, as well as fostering the stronger connections between education and the labor market. This is critical more than ever because it is impossible to tackle new challenges we are facing today without collaboration between governments, enterprises, educational institutions, and communities. Next, Karin, a very passionate, incredible head delegate of the EU, will be covering 3 other points.
Thank you very much, Kana. Dear organizers, dear guests, dear Y7 colleagues, let me express how delighted and thankful I am that we are here today side by side, camera by camera, and despite all the difficulties, standing for and expressing the strong voice of youth. These votes have also been the main focus points of our track. The intersectional approach that Kana just presented is actually linked to the fact that education and jobs is indeed a very broad topic. We had a debate on how to proceed in putting all the policies from our presentations together and how we should organize them into different themes. Finally, we decided to do that on an individual basis and then combine these visions into one. We observed at the same time that this year, our negotiations and the final communique haven't been given any specific or common direction, as it was the case under last year's French presidency, for instance, which was focusing on inequalities. Hence, in our respective recommendations country by country, some of us focused more on tackling those specific situations that arose this year, so the pandemic and related economic recession, or fractured global leadership and coordination. And we combined all these with more long-term vision and goals, which were presented by others. Secondly, of course, when we were trying to tackle the consequences of the pandemic, we also faced uncertainties around its possible impact. So lack of data, it's still a live situation. So we know COVID-19 has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities and created and shed light on some new inequalities, new barriers for specific groups. But we need to come up with an approach incorporating the fact that the situation is still evolving and work on basis of current ongoing expert analysis and compare their predictions for the future. Thus, overall, we basically face problems in terms of a series of contrasts. The third of these dichotomies was to combine the technology in education and jobs, which came into spotlight in particular under COVID-19, together with the ongoing and more structural access issues to education and the labor market for youth. So, whereas there are millions of children that do not complete primary education, have an access to television, let alone an access to digital tools, and it is still the case all around the world. At the same time, we needed to incorporate also challenges connected to automation and digital market or digital literacy, so issues whose importance increases every day. And we also needed to add some improvements in education that should have been installed a long time ago, such as financial literacy or elaborated civic education to enhance youth participation in public life, as well as out-of-box thinking. So while the generally perceived 21st century challenge has been to ensure access to digital tools, training, upskilling, and adapting to new ways of working, we also need to tackle issues around poverty, lack of basic education infrastructure, informal and low-paid jobs, and of course, all sources of inequality. To present you how we reconciled all these dilemmas is now up to my esteemed colleagues, starting with Gerber Chahal, the esteemed Canadian head delegate to Y7, whose inputs were always constructive and always brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Next slide, please. Hi, everyone. My name is Kirpir Chahal, and I'm the head delegate from Canada. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that Calgary, Alberta, is on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nation, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. I also acknowledge that the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Métis Nation, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So going into our recommendations, we've split them into 7 themes. The first theme is around structural inequalities. This is about creating conditions for children and young people to thrive because schools alone cannot fill the gap. Structural inequality penetrates all aspects of young people's lives and perpetuates a cycle of being left behind. This is evident from the current pandemic. With over 1 billion young people currently out of school, the poorest and most vulnerable young people are hit the hardest because it's not just their right to education that is impacted. They're unable to access social services, or they're now living in food poverty. Indigenous communities or those living in remote areas were already struggling to access education and employment due to a lack of basic infrastructure or remote learning tools, but their basic needs are also not being met. We need to dismantle inequitable and discriminatory structures by committing to end child poverty. Quality pre-primary education sets the foundation for learning. Children's brains develop at a shocking rate in the early years of life, and they must be provided the environments to facilitate this appropriately. But high-quality pre-primary education is not affordable or available to most families, so many children are left behind even before they begin school. And the impacts of this begin to show as early as primary school and are even more pronounced for disadvantaged children. So we have to invest in quality and universal early childhood learning because this has huge economic and social payoffs. It supports parents and boosts female employment. It helps children fulfill their right to education, and it also helps to end child poverty. We also need locally led action to help families understand the importance of education and provide targeted support to youth, including youth with disabilities who are more likely to be out of school or work as a result of discrimination and inaccessibility. They live in challenging environments with physical and communication barriers that make it hard to participate. Inclusive education is able to reduce discrimination by enabling children with and without disabilities to grow up together while learning the skills they need to succeed. But low school budgets result in a lack of appropriate facilities, inaccessible school buildings, high pupil-to-teacher ratios, and limited support for children with disabilities. We also need to prepare youth for the technological revolution, and again, youth with disabilities represent a large portion of currently unemployed youth. They are unequipped for the world of work. So employers also need to be prioritizing workplace adjustment and targeted training for youth with disabilities so they're not an afterthought. Finally, we need better disaggregated and intersectional data to understand these issues, to create evidence-based policies and monitor progress. Surveys related to children and young people are developed in isolation. They're not linked to programs or other surveys. Researchers, charities, governments don't know the scope of existing data work, and wide range of efforts and sources of data means initiatives are uncoordinated and don't share information with each other. Longitudinal surveys are also critical for understanding the impact of young people's socioeconomic backgrounds on their futures. So we need to join up the data on youth education, employment, health, family, in order to bridge youth policies. Without tackling these structural and intergenerational inequalities and understanding their impact on youth social mobility, we can expect investment in education and employment systems to pay off. Next slide, please. Our next theme is also around ensuring inclusive education. So while I said that investment may not pay off if we don't tackle underlying issues, public spending is still crucial because our education systems are not up to par. We are in a global learning crisis, especially with billions of young people out of school. Many young learners don't have the appropriate resources at home to continue their learning while out of school, and learners without digital tools or support from family members are being left behind. Young people have the right to a robust education where they live, but currently our education systems are not meeting the unique needs of youth. Most G7 countries only spend 4 or 5% on domestic education, and austerity cuts mean that schools do not have enough money to pay for stationery, textbooks, let alone infrastructure improvements. Further, in countries like Canada without national oversight of post-secondary education, young people are struggling with the cost of higher education and debt. We understand the value of higher education and technical training, but we don't see our country's commitment to facilitating this access. Tuition fees continues to rise, and the only answer is to turn towards government and private loans. Students now owe trillions of dollars worth of debt as a result, and this financial burden is limiting our ability to contribute to our communities, to buy homes, to start small businesses, and we need to close this wealth gap. Without debt cancellation and increased spending on education, an entire generation of children will be disenfranchised. Infrastructure access and affordability issues are impacting vulnerable youth most of all, and the gender divide is another major issue. Gender-sensitive pedagogy means ensuring equal opportunities to education while tackling gender stereotypes. But we're not adequately thinking about how to offer inclusive and quality education for girls, women, and all genders. Curriculum should empower students to learn about and challenge gender stereotypes, and project-based learning should promote equal participation. And we also need to be working to create safe and accessible spaces to allow every gender to reach their full potential. Without this, we will continue to see high school dropout rates for girls and an increasing gap between male and female employment outcomes. The disparities that I've mentioned so far have broad-reaching impacts on the mental health of young people. Around the world, millions of young people are experiencing mental health issues, and yet the majority are unable to access the tools and resources they need. Services are poorly coordinated and underfunded. Young people are having to wait too long for support. They don't know where to go, or they can't afford the services they need. School closures during the pandemic have also negatively impacted the mental health of young people. We have to take this seriously and offer preventative, personalized care to young people where they live and work. There are strong links between young people's well-being, their educational outcomes, as well as their ability to secure meaningful employment. So this is a responsibility that must be equally shared by governments and employers. I'm now going to pass off to my wonderful colleague, Vanessa from Italy, to talk about the next thematic recommendations.
Thank you very much, Kirby. And may I ask to move to the next slide? Okay. So hello, everybody. My name is Vanessa Boy, and I am the Italian delegate for the policy track, education and jobs. So after finishing their studies, the biggest challenge that young people have to face is enter the labor market and pass the so-called skills matching challenge. In some countries, those are the biggest issues. This is why we, as representatives of the youth in the G7 countries, developed in our third section 4 policy recommendations that call world leaders to ensure the connection between young people and the labor market since the secondary school and continuing, of course, at the higher levels of education, involving mentors, educators, and career guidance experts. Often young people have also to accept any job just to gain work experience and maybe find a better one day. This is not the right attitude. We strongly demand for new and innovative school curricula that offer young people the possibility to be trained on new skills in line with the times and that will facilitate their integration into the labor market. We also strongly believe that there is the necessity to promote lifelong learning and continuous upskilling of workers. This has to become a pillar for employment. Finally, as students are the future of countries, we ask for decent salaries for our teachers as the future development of any nation is in their hands. May I have to move to the next slide? Thank you. So if young people manage just to enter the labor market and find a job, they then bump into unequal working conditions and opportunities. We need to develop socioeconomic policies, setting ambitious targets, and improving working conditions, focusing on youth-sensitive approaches. In our fourth session, we are calling the G7 leaders, first of all, to reduce the youth unemployment rate. As you know, this has drastically increased by COVID-19 pandemic, and we're asking them to reduce this value by at least 50% by 2025. We have today, as you may know, 68 million young people with no job. Youth unemployment needs to become a priority in national plans of world leaders with specific policies targeted to the employment problems faced, of course, by the youth. We also demand for the acknowledgement of young people's work by banning unpaid internships all over the world that just contributes to underline and enforce inequalities. in access to opportunities, specifically for low-income kids that cannot afford to work for free. We need then a fair and equal working system where no one is left behind, no matter your gender, your age, or your race. In 2020, higher paid positions are still mainly filled by men, and lower paid positions are mainly filled by women. Gender equality is a precondition for any powerful nation and for their development. So we show zero tolerance to gender wage gap and to any kind of discrimination and racial and discrimination based on race or diversity. We pretend the achievement of gender parity and racial diversity at the very top leadership positions. We need to implement and promote gender-neutralizing parental leave and subsidized childcare, but we also find essential to reinforce knowledge on social services, both for needs young people or those in the gig or informal economy. Finally, we cannot let the ideas of present and future young generations to be overlooked. Young people have new ways, of course, of looking at the problems. So we need to stimulate them and to promote youth entrepreneurship. That's why we're asking to the world leaders to facilitate in some way the access, for example, to credit at zero interest rates for young people and any kind of instrument or support to enable young people to implement their ideas. So we must to ensure youth the opportunity to develop their potential, and definitely we need to be engaged in our nation's development. Thank you very much, and now I leave the floor to my very passionate colleague from France, Khadija.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. My name is Khadija Ben Ramdan. I'm part of the French delegation. So this leads us to the following recommendation that particularly echoes the amazing presentation of the energy and peace and security. So, young people from all over the world have specifically shown in the past 10 years their full commitment and concern on climate change risks and challenges. Could we just please move to the next slide? So still, surprisingly, a large proportion of those same young people is still not having the opportunities to be included on a professional level in the global green economy transition. Hence, a fair and just green transition must be able to balance sustainable economic growth and job creation at the national and global level with climate action and inequality reduction objectives. In fact, we need to integrate climate objectives into social and economic policies, and the opposing of these two major challenges needs to end. We must keep in mind that with carefully designed adaptation strategies, economic restructuring brought about by the green economy will result with the creation of 24 million new jobs worldwide by 2030. So, as the nature of growth is becoming green, we need to act now to make the green transition a revolution for youth employment by enabling millions of young people to overcome their precarity and allowing the young generation to finally take charge and shape this global transition. Mandatory education on climate change in schools, in workplaces, coupled with the creation of free, certified green training centers as opportunities, especially for low-skilled young people, are key for an equitable transition towards green economies and resilient, sustainable societies. So this leads us to the following slide, if I may add. Thank you very much. So this leads us to another major topic, the one of digitalization. So as you know, the world is in the midst of rapid, revolutionary, and often disruptive technological breakthroughs. And as the COVID-19 crisis underlines, the nature of work is constantly changing. High-speed internet offers workers and employers more flexibility, efficiency in the use of resources. But on the other hand, the same technology could also erode workers' bargaining powers and work-related benefits. Where technologies bring productivity gains, for instance, it also widens social inequalities. So to declare the internet as a global public good and invest in public access solutions, including citywide Wi-Fi, is absolutely needed. Rapid technological progress requires a continual upgrading of workforce skills. It is therefore important to modernize vocational training programs and invest in digital skills and knowledge that enables young people and workers to perform new tasks over a lifetime of changing work environments, making sure that education systems are inclusive so that opportunities are equitably shared, to mandate schools and employers to support flexible learning and work modalities and ensure young people are provided safe and operational environments, whether working in person or remotely, is more than ever a necessity. Proactive policies and supportive institutions are needed at a national, regional, and global level to make sure that the digital revolution leaves no one behind. Thank you very much. I'll leave the floor again to Kirby.
Thanks very much, Khadija. Next slide, please. So our final thematic recommendation is around reinforcing international cooperation and commitment to the SDGs. With only 10 years to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we are concerned about our world's ability to realize every person's right to education and meaningful employment. Even as a percentage of global overseas development aid has gone up over the years, the share for education, especially primary education, has stagnated. Education's share in total aid fell 6 years in a row, from 10% in 2009 to 6.9% in 2015. If we are to achieve the SDGs, we must increase overseas development aid and ensure that it's sufficiently targeted to the countries and regions that need it the most. Many donors talk about education but fail to deliver on funding. UK is the only G7 country currently meeting the 0.7 ODA target since 2013. Maintaining and increasing ODA budgets are even more important now, as the pandemic will have far-reaching impacts on education, especially in lower-income countries. Multilaterals and communities have also been highlighting the need for education to be prioritized during emergencies. During the crisis, the focus of governments and development agencies remains on providing food, shelter, and water at the expense of neglecting education. 75 million school-aged young people were already missing school because of armed conflict, forced displacement, and climate change-induced disasters. Now, as a result of COVID-19, they are even more vulnerable. Yet, only 2% of humanitarian spending goes towards education. Education in emergencies can help youth in crisis access mental health and other support while providing a safe place to learn. When children are out of school during a conflict or crisis, it increases their risk of child trafficking or child prostitution. Girls are almost twice as likely to be out of primary school if they live in conflict-affected areas, showing the disproportionate impacts of disasters on girls and young women. We need to prioritize education within humanitarian response to help build young people's resilience to future disasters and to ensure they have a way out of their current situation towards a promising future. We also need to increase young women's participation in informal education and training, especially in rural areas where they can't go to school. Training can make women self-independent and help them contribute to building resilient communities. In developing countries, women play a crucial role in contributions to agriculture production, as an example. On average, women make up about 43% of the agriculture labor force in developing countries. If women had the same access to productive resources as men, they could increase yields on their farms by 20 to 30% and reduce the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. Women's unequal access to skills and training, along with discrimination within their communities and society at large, along with the absence of alternative income generation opportunities, are key challenges. Finally, a tool to achieve solidarity and cooperation across the world is mobility. We need to provide opportunities for young people to take part in education programs and work abroad. These redesigned partnerships should ensure that it becomes easier for all motivated young people to move around the world and to profit from our interconnectivity. This, of course, implies an increased investment in programs in terms of scholarships, travel grants, special project funding, all based on students' needs, but also to mobilize private shareholders to engage in mobility support. During the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen a substantial lack of coordination because of school closures and online learning and examinations. One of the most affected populations were young people who were studying or working abroad. They didn't have the possibility to return to their families on time because of school policy responses or a lack of information, especially considering their scholarships. These supranational partnerships should therefore enhance resilience and facilitate coordination of youth and support for youth across borders in case of emergencies. Thank you. And I'll now pass over to my colleague Michael from Germany to close this presentation.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Before we're going to look forward to you take your questions, we want to thank you all for your attention and especially YPFP for the chance to be connected with all of you during this time. Thank you very much for this. And now we are very excited to answer your questions, and I'm giving back to our wonderful Sherpa, Elizabeth.
Hello, thank you everyone, and thank you to my tracker, that great presentation. All right, so we're going to move into questions, and we have many that are coming in, many really great questions here. So starting with the first one, how can we ensure that no child is left out during the COVID pandemic and post-COVID, especially in rural communities? I think, Giovanni, you wanted to add your perspective.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for this question. I just strongly believe that we need to continue to push our governments to continue their work at aligning, tracking, and implementing their initiatives with targets and indicators of the SDGs. This is a document that was approved 5 years ago, and it should serve as our common blueprint for humanity in terms of peace and prosperity, so that children and youth are at the center of these responses. We only have 10 years left, and this is the UN's Decade of Action, and simultaneously South-South cooperation, North-South cooperation, and triangular cooperation all need to be reinforced as we work to overcome the effects of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Gio. And did Vanessa, did you also want to add something to this question?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So I totally agree with Giovanni on, of course, this very important point. And I also think that through our policy recommendations, we try to, of course, think about these young people that now, specifically in this pandemic situation, are of course out of schools, and they're having a lot of troubles in be educated, specifically in the LDCs countries. This is why we try to develop also some policy proposals oriented to their education, as we try to do for the refugee camps. You can imagine these young people were not able to go to school before, and now the situation is even worse. So I think that the world leaders should have to focus on these minorities also, and these disadvantaged populations, to give them the same opportunities of all the other young people all over the world, using also the instruments that we have. For example, I've heard from some villages in Africa that to avoid the problem of not going to school for the young people, they use the radio communication to give the lessons to the young students. So also if they are far from the local maybe center. So it is necessary to, of course, move together to do some big change in this way. And I really hope that our policy recommendation will be in this way, in some way useful also for the world leader to understand how for us is also important the education of the other more disadvantaged young people. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Gio. The next question is, due to the virus's huge impact on the world, how will this pose a challenge to create more jobs for young people? I believe Zoe, would you like to answer this question? Zoe, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. So thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for this question as well. This is something where a global effort is really required to overcome the challenges that young people are going to experience, because it is inevitable that there is going to be a number of issues that they will face getting jobs in the future. I think a big challenge will be around those graduating during or shortly after the pandemic. We've already seen a reduction in the number of graduate schemes and international exchanges taking place. And this may pose an issue for young people finding work in the sector that they've studied for. And this might prevent young people from being able to enter the world of work, as some qualifications aren't broad enough to allow them to access other highly skilled jobs. And this isn't something that is localized to certain countries. This is across the globe. It's not only going to be a problem for those that are coming out of university or college. Those that aren't or haven't followed that route will still experience challenges. And as mentioned before, the amount of people across the globe that travel over borders for work is a large proportion of the population. And therefore, we need to ensure that those whose skills are usually utilised around the world in not their home country are still able to find work and successfully adapt within their country, whether that be virtually or whatever form that may bring. So we need to make sure that people's contribution to the labour market is not overlooked just because they aren't able to carry out their usual role. One big thing here to be successful will be digitalisation being successful. If we can successfully digitalise our world, and we live in a connected world where everyone is able to access internet and everyone is able to access the resources they need to successfully work virtually or carry out their job from wherever they may be, then this will exclude those living in minority groups, living in poor areas across the globe, from not only accessing education, but accessing the jobs that are so much needed by people. Lastly, this also could be a time to start encouraging young people to look at the jobs that are still underpopulated, such as those highlighted by the pandemic, such as medical staff, research and development roles, and public services, just to name a few, as well as educating people around low carbon jobs that could not only offer solutions to problems of underpopulated jobs in the labour market, but also help us to move towards greener education and labour systems. Thank you, Elizabeth. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say.
Thank you, Zoe. We're actually going to move on to the next question just for sake of time. The next question is, now that many countries are carrying out education reforms, should we add a proper amount of practical knowledge to exam-oriented education and allow students to use the internet more widely? Michael, would you like to answer this question?
Yes, thank you very much. We think that it's very important to redesign school curricula and also testing methods. Therefore, we ask the G7 leaders to implement mandatory financial and digital skills training, but not only for the students, but also for the teachers. And we think that it's very crucial that we provide young people with free digital tools, capacity building workshops, and technical support. As well, it can be a chance to include new elements into the curricula, kind of mandatory climate change education in schools and workplaces, so that they can have a very actual and new topic for their work life afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. The next question is, how do you think international education systems, such as the IB, for example, should navigate education for the coming period, as only this year's graduating cohort is being into consideration, keeping in mind that infection rates vary from nation to nation? Kana, would you like to answer this question?
Thank you, Elias, and thank you for such a great question. I think this is very critical. So as we covered in our policy recommendation in our theme 7, which is about international cooperation, we strongly believe that G7 and EU countries need to ensure increased investment in international partnerships on mobility of students and teachers, So, of course, we have to see the impact of COVID-19 and to wait and ensure we can safely travel and that students can make the most of studying abroad experiences. However, we believe that the government and schools need to reinforce its partnerships, and as soon as each country reopens its border, we should resume and make sure students can have international learning experiences. In order to reinforce global solidarity and for youth across the globe to tackle the global issues together, we strongly believe it is crucial to ensure students can seize opportunities learn from each other across the globe. So, yeah, thank you for the great point.
Thank you, Kana. The next question is, how can we solve the problem of structural unemployment that is caused by new technologies replacing human labor?
Elizabeth. So it is certain that not only lower qualified job positions are nowadays being replaced with technologies. However, as the numerous analyses suggest, the immense problem of youth unemployment nowadays is mostly due to the lack of positions, for instance, as a consequence of financial crisis. But not only, now we saw millions of young people to lose their job again due to COVID-19. So here, obviously, special government measures to support youth are needed. But there is also skills mismatch, problems such as skills mismatch, lack of entrepreneurship skills, and access to capital to actually promote the entrepreneurship among young people to profit and to allow them to profit from the benefits of the financial world, as we also underlined in the communique. Of course, to prevent the structural unemployment to be exacerbated by technologies replacing human labor in the near future, at the education level, it all comes back to qualification and redesigning of skills. So as we implied in our recommendation, it is crucial to modernize the training programs to equip youth with skills for engaging with the digital economy, including AI, robotics, and programming. But not only that, we can promote critical thinking and problem-solving skills. We also need to redesign school curricula and testing methods to support creative and adaptable skill bases for young people that will be therefore more flexible in their choice of job at the labor market. Because what we face now is an occupational change related to the process of disappearance, but also creation and transformation of jobs in the labor market. So in this process, teachers as well need to be incentivized to learn new ways of teaching and testing to actually prepare the young generation for such challenges. And of course, it is crucial to implement such measures so that in maybe not that distant future, humans and machines might find themselves in a symbiotic relationship, helping each other do what they do best. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, thank you. So then our last question will then be this. A number of Aboriginal people face the threat of residential schools that marginalize them using policies that threaten their human rights. How do we promote education to these Indigenous people while ensuring that the government does not replace them of their rights? And Kurt Beers, would you like to answer this?
Sure. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. To whomever who asked this question, this is extremely important, and thank you for asking. You know, the trauma of Indigenous people being forced into residential schools is still having generational long impacts. It has impacted Indigenous communities in every way that you can imagine. Currently in Canada, Indigenous people experience the highest level of poverty, with 53% of children living in poverty. They have high rates of suicide, poor mental health, they lack access to clean drinking water, and face persisting barriers to education and employment. The education gap for First Nations and Indigenous communities has also been increasing. First Nations children are seeing lower rates of high school graduation, so only 48% of First Nations children living on reserve complete high school, and only about 10% of Indigenous people between 25 and 34 years old have a high school diploma. So really what we need to be doing is to increase public investment and funding to improve basic infrastructure and to also ensure that Indigenous communities have the resources that they need to run education and employment systems the way that works for their communities. We need to ensure that Indigenous young people have support when they leave their reserves and move into urban areas. We need to develop cultural connections and inclusive spaces for them. We need Indigenous employment and healing hubs, Indigenous mentorship. We need to invest in their entrepreneurial, economic, and Indigenous growth. We need to incentivize businesses to do the same. And we also need to make sure that our teachers, employers, and businesses all have training on cultural sensitivity to build trust with Indigenous communities again. We also need to make sure that education and employment programs are developed and managed by Indigenous people to once again ensure that they are working for their communities.
All right, well, that's all of the questions, or all of the time that we have to answer questions. So thank you everyone for sending such really great questions and for listening to our presentation.